I'm Natalie Walton, and this is Imprint, a podcast about creating a home and life you love. Each week, I'm here to share with you some of the biggest lessons I've learned during my career and life. Some of them I wish I'd learned a lot sooner because they would have saved me a huge amount of time, stress, and even money. Many of these ideas could have accelerated my journey as a creative and business owner. I also feature interviews with inspiring creatives, entrepreneurs, and experts to help you focus on what's most important in your life. Today, I'm going to interview interior designer Arabella McIntosh. Before we start today's episode, I just wanted to thank you for all of your beautiful comments and feedback on this podcast. If you haven't done so already, it would mean so much if you could please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening to the podcast today. It really does help other like-minded creatives out there find this content and help them on their creative journey. Okay, back to today's episode. Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. Recently I drove down to Yamba, which is about an hour and a half south of Byron Bay, to meet Arabella McIntosh. I will share some behind the scenes pics with you in this week's newsletter. You can sign up at nataliewalton.com. Some of you might remember Arabella's home in Venice Beach, California, which featured in my first book, This Is Home. And some of you might also remember that I featured her home in Bondi before that in Real Living magazine. Anyway, we talk about that and a whole lot more. I hope you enjoy learning more about Arabella and her creative journey. Hi, Arabella. Thank you so much for welcoming me into, well, I'm going to call it your home, but maybe we can talk a little bit about that in a moment. This is, we're in Yamba, which is on the east coast of Australia, and we're about 2 hours south of Byron. So I just drove down here for the morning, and it's so nice to see Arabella again because we were just working out before I hit record that it's been about 3.5 years since we last met, when I went to LA and met Arabella. It was actually for the second time because we had shot your home in Bondi when you were living in Australia. Then you went over to the States to live there for a while, and I shot your home for my first book, This Is Home. And you were the first home that we shot on our Chris and mine, our kind of worldwide trip for that book. And we've kind of been in contact ever since, and it's been really interesting to watch your journey since then. So I'm excited to finally get the chance to interview you for the podcast. And I guess, welcome. And I'm going to ask you, first of all, for you to share a little bit about your story and the very beginning. So, because I'm really interested in the types of childhoods that people have and how that informs their journey going forward. I think it's always interesting to see what kind of imprint that has on people. So do you want to start at the very beginning, Arabella, and just tell us where you grew up and the type of childhood you had?
Sure. Well, thank you for coming as well. And I appreciate you driving down this morning. It's nice to have you here. So my childhood, I grew up in the inner west of Sydney in a town, well, a village, I guess, called Balmain, which in the late 80s, 90s was quite a barefoot, hippie, artistic community. I was, I guess, imprinted by my friends' parents and my parents' friends, who were sort of all creatives, sort of photographers, stylists, filmmakers. Very early on sort of had that creative imprint in sort of freelance sort of careers. I think my parents were antique dealers, so we had a store on the main street of Balmain where we lived sort of in a warehouse style house behind that. So we spent a lot of time in the store with my parents watching them work. My mum is an artist and my dad restored all the furniture, so quite creative in their own rights. My dad's sort of a master craftsman. There's not much he can't really make or do, and so watching him figure things out creatively was sort of, like a big part of my life from early on. I don't sort of remember having a whole lot of toys or, I didn't sort of grow up, I guess, the same way that I see other people growing up, or even the way somewhat my kids, like so many toys and things like that. We didn't really have that much stuff, and it wasn't like one of those, I went to school barefoot and walked 5 miles. It wasn't like a sad story like that. It was just that our entertainment was by imagining things and making things. We would set up stalls outside our parents' store and imitate them and sort of make things, craft things and see what we could sell. Or I had dolls, which I learned to sew quite early on. And I think I was sort of 8 when I started sewing the clothes for my dolls. Like it was, we just sort of made things up as we went.
And you say we, so do you have siblings and how many?
I have one sister.
Okay, and you the older or the younger
I'm
one?
the younger sister.
Okay, and I'm always interested in that as well, like the dynamic that plays on someone. Were you very similar in personalities? And do you think did you follow her or did you do your own thing? And what kind of age gap as well?
She's sort of 2.5 years older than me, and we are very similar. Probably not so much in personalities, but in interests, we're very similar. I guess we did very similar things, and I probably followed her a lot in terms of the things she did, particularly sporting wise. If she played hockey, I played hockey. If she did gymnastics, I wanted to do gymnastics. So she had a better focus than me. I'm sort of, I guess, more of a hummingbird with the things that I'm passionate about, and I'll sort of be into something and then move on to the next thing. And I'm a little more like sort of, I'd sort of flit around a little bit more, whereas she is sort of the person that once she finds something that she's interested in, she goes the whole way and she is a complete expert and pro at whatever that is. And like whether it was gymnastics, she was the one that went to nationals. Like she was the one that really had the endurance.
First child.
Yes, the first child. And I just sort of went, oh, that looks good. That's good. I'll do that. Or I just sort of followed along, I guess.
Yeah. What does she do now?
She works for local government, so in the waste minimisation department. So she's a town planner by trade, but she also studied environmental science. So has sort of her career sort of changed from sort of town planning to sustainability, what do you call it? Like advising on sustainable policy, working into urban agriculture, and now she works for Yarra Council in Victoria in the waste minimisation department. So she's been a big influence in my sort of approach to sustainability.
Yeah, I can sort of connect the dots a little bit now.
Yeah, and she goes, as I say, she goes deep into, her knowledge base on these things. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, a great resource for you, no doubt.
It is, yeah. I call her a lot and say, can you consult me on this or give me an idea of this? And she just has so many resources and ideas and points me in the right direction all the time.
Yeah. Okay, so you started like your early years in Balmain, but you moved to the Hunter Valley, didn't you, at some point?
Mm-hmm. So when I was sort of just before I started high school, we moved to a small town called Morpeth in the Hunter Valley, which is just sort of inland of Newcastle. My parents closed down their antique business. They'd sort of been doing it for, I think, 12 years and were ready to sort of move on to a different chapter of their life, and a bit of a tree change, I guess. And had a property on the river in Morpeth, and my sister and I were really, really big into horse riding. So it was an easy decision for us to sort of go up there and follow that passion.
And how old were you when that happened?
I think I was 11.
Okay, so it's quite a formative age, isn't it,
yes,
to have something like that happen?
Yeah, we went from like quite a big primary school to going to a primary school. I think there's less than 20 kids in my grade. So it was quite a big change for me to go from a big sort of city school to quite a small school, but it was a really good move for our family.
Yeah, and you instantly enjoyed being in that kind of environment in the countryside?
Yeah, we were. I mean, we were lucky enough that we'd been coming back and forth a fair bit. On the weekends, we'd had the house a little bit earlier than for a couple of years before we moved. So we were going up on the weekends and doing pony club and things like that. So it wasn't like a huge shock for us. We had some friends and things that we had made over those weekends that we were up there.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's go to high school and those kind of years when you start to kind of get, I guess, a bit of an inkling about your interests and what you think you might want to do post-school years. Did you have any sense of what you wanted to do?
No. To be honest, and I mean this in the nicest way, I watched my parents run their own business and being very creative, and I did not want to do that. I watched, how many weekends that they worked, and I wanted to work for I wanted to work for a big company. I wanted to have a reliable wage, and I really pushed against what had been brought up knowing. I wanted new furniture. I couldn't understand why we always had to have furniture that someone else owned. Everything was old, and everyone else had these sort of minimal houses with white furniture, and it all just seemed so shiny and easy. And that's sort of what I wanted. And so I studied business. My sister sort of followed more of that creative. She did art for her HSC, whereas I just said absolutely not. And I really sort of pushed the other way. I studied business and that type of thing. And yeah, I kind of rebelled against my sort of, I guess now I know deep-seated passions, but I didn't sort of recognize that as a teenager.
It's so funny because in many ways, though, then you and your sister have kind of almost swapped roles.
Absolutely.
That you've sort of gone this completely creative path
Mm-hmm.
and with no sort of, in some ways, security or like, the conventionality of working for an employer. And your sister has gone back the other way.
Yeah, she's worked for council for a long, like most of her career, worked in government.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have sort of definitely switched. It took me quite a while. I was sort of not into my 20s before I sort of accepted, the direction. And it was a slow transition, I think. It wasn't something that I really did with intention. It just sort of happened organically for me.
Okay, so take me to then, so you went and did business at uni, is that right?
Yeah, so I was accepted into a degree, and I still wasn't really sure at that point. I actually wasn't even, in year 11, I wasn't even planning on getting my UAI to go to uni. And then I sort of caught up on some subjects and thought, yes, no, I'm going to do business. This is what I'm going to do. And then I left. I did completely switched and went to fashion design at TAFE for a year, and then traveled, just sort of thought I'm just going to get away and clear my head and just do what every, teenager does and take some time. And then I came back and I did study. I studied a combined degree in business and law, which I really loved the law side of it. I wanted to do corporate law, and that's the reason I did the combined degree, but I was actually more interested in the law, but I could see it changing my personality not in a way that I really wanted to sort of see progress. And so I decided to drop the law and finish the business. My dad sort of really pushed me to finish my business degree. And so I did. So I finished my business degree, and then it's funny, you don't really know. Maybe more so now, but for me, when I grew up, I didn't really know that there was that many careers out there outside of those sort of standard teacher, those ones that you sort of easily recognizable. And had I known that there was more jobs out there that combined both left and right brain, I might not have resisted it so much.
Yeah, that was very much my experience as well. I always loved writing when I was at high school, but I knew that I couldn't be a struggling artist. I couldn't be a struggling writer, and so I started to do an economics degree, and quickly decided that was not for me. But I thought, well, I guess I better be a journalist, because I just couldn't see how, it was like you were an accountant or you were a lawyer or you were a journalist. Absolutely. Or these very defined kind of roles. So I think the world's changed a lot since then, but certainly sort of back then, I think it was much more defined. And so what was your first job then once you finished uni?
So I'd started working for a fashion designer during my degree. And when I finished that, I ended up working in the wholesale side of their business as, in design and production management. So I spent the first couple of years outside of my degree going back to fashion, just sort of flip-flopping all over the place. But I worked traveling between Newcastle and Bali, doing collections for that brand, and working. They had a retail store and then a wholesale part of the business as well.
And how did you get that? Was that through connections, or did you intern, or
I started on the shop floor.
Right.
Yeah. So while I was studying, I worked weekends, as a sales assistant.
Yeah.
I would also worked for an interior design company in Newcastle as well, doing, working on the shop floor, and then working there was in-house interior designers as well. So they were sort of the two jobs that I did through uni.
Yep.
Of course, as well as bar work, as everyone else does. But and then that business kept growing, and I just sort of changed roles within that company.
And did you have any mentors within that company?
Yeah, I would say the owner and director of that business, Linda, I learned a lot from her. She was someone that was insanely creative and talented, but she had this way of sort of trusting, like recognizing that she couldn't do everything and trusting other people. And I think she trusted me in my process, and that let her be more creative, whereas she didn't sort of try and control every sort of element of it, which I think is really hard to do when you're in a creative field, because you want to have control over everything, and that process of letting go is quite hard. She also would sort of, I guess, this is my take on how she did it. Maybe it wasn't, but I sort of felt like she was quite flexible with the last sort of, or fluid with the last sort of maybe 5-10% of her design collections. We would sort of, once we'd get overseas to sort of work out what the final touches were in terms of found materials. And that's something that I've sort of put into my work, is sort of having quite a big, a solid idea of where I want to go with a project, but then leaving, a little bit of room for fluidity in terms of what materials I find, and just sort of making a few last minute decisions. And I think that problem solving gives you a sort of more bespoke or more unique outcome.
Yeah. And so what was then your next kind of couple of steps after working for that business?
I then moved to Sydney, and moved back to Sydney and worked for another fashion company, but in buying. So I started out, I guess it's the Iconic now, when it was just a startup, and I was an assistant buyer in women's wear there, and was there for almost 4 years, working my way up to senior buying positions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that for me, that is a job that I never knew existed. If someone had told me that when I was studying fashion design, I would have thought, absolutely, like spreadsheets and collections, and it's just that left brain, right brain sort of mix. And that was just, for me, it was like mind-boggling that job even was out there, and I had no idea.
Yeah. And so what were the things that you learned? What were some of the big lessons you learned from that job?
Planning, trusting the data, and like analytics. It was a very analytical job, sort of basing it off customer behavior and patterns and things like that. So I guess the business side of it, like the business planning, like how to actually forecast business performance and buy to that. I think that was probably the big thing that I took out of there, is as well as getting really good at spreadsheets.
And so what happened after the Iconic? Where did you go?
So after the Iconic, I left, and that's when I started Palm Beach Black. So I'd been working in denim, and I sort of wanted to move away from fashion and the seasonality of fashion, and find a use for the materials that were heading for landfill. So I started trying to find a second chapter, I guess, for the denim that people no longer wanted. And that's when I started sort of sourcing vintage jeans and making them into pillows, and starting this sort of business based on the circular economy, which I kind of didn't even know what that term was at that point. I just knew that there were so many beautiful materials already in circulation, that it just seemed so crazy that they didn't have a second life. And particularly with denim, it just gets better with age. So to give it a second chapter just made complete sense to me. Yeah. And then after that, I started that business, and I ended up going to work for the sister company of the Iconic and working as a furniture buyer. And that's when I sort of started that move into interiors, buying the furniture, doing private label, and then doing a lot of in-house styling for lifestyle shots, and working in the studio doing a lot of styling.
And at any point, did you feel like, either when you started Palm Beach Black or even maybe doing the styling, that like, this is the thing that I want to be doing, or had that not happened yet?
Oh, I mean, I loved my role at the Iconic. It was insane. It was the best time of my life. But there was a point when I decided I didn't want to be in fashion anymore, and taking the job with furniture, that all made sense to me. It was something that I was very familiar to me growing up, obviously, and my parents being furniture dealers. There's so many things clicked for me.
Yeah.
There was just so much knowledge that I had sort of just stored away and tried to sort of push down, that just sort of all just came back to life, like construction. And things just started to then slot into place for me.
And what about, so when you started Palm Beach Black, was that initially a bit of a side kind of hustle or a side business, or were you doing that in itself? Like, I'm just wondering, was that a bit of a leap of faith for you to sort of, because after working for all these companies and you saying that you didn't want to do something that wasn't working for a business, was that your first big leap of faith in trusting yourself?
Yeah, I guess so. And it was, it was a side thing. When I left the Iconic, I left because I was pregnant with my first child. So I was on maternity leave, and as a lot of women do, we decide that life isn't complicated enough. I'm going to start a business whilst having a newborn baby. So it started off as a side project and just sort of evolved from there.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe shortly after, that's when I met you in Bondi, because you still had Palm Beach Black.
Yes.
And I don't know if you were pregnant or...
I was just pregnant. You were pregnant.
Oh,
I
okay.
think you were,
Probably.
I think you were pregnant, and then I was, quite early days in my pregnancy.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you were living in this beautiful apartment in Bondi, and but shortly after that, then you made the decision to move to the US. Was that right?
Yeah. So probably about a year after that.
Right.
Yeah. It wasn't. Yeah. It was just going to be for 2 years, and then 4.5 years later, we were still there.
Yeah. And so like I said, we met again when you were living then in California at Venice Beach, and it was really interesting because then you had started. I don't know what were you doing primarily when you first got to the US? Were you still working or mainly Palm Beach Black?
Yeah, I started working with an interior design and staging company. So we sort of teamed up to do, I did all the styling and design work. She had all the inventory, and it was quite a really good marriage in terms of, it was something that I hadn't done before. Staging was also one of these things that you don't really grow up knowing about. And that was awesome because I just learned so much about that market, and the staging work then turn into more design work as customers that we'd sold houses to then wanted us to go and then decorate their new homes, and it just sort of all sort of tied in together.
How did you get that job?
That was just serendipitous. That was me having a conversation with someone at a coffee shop and talking about the work that I did, and we just sort of hit it off and just decided to give it a shot, and it worked really well.
And you didn't know each other prior to that?
No.
That's amazing.
Yeah, she'd had the company and had all the furniture, but didn't want to be doing the styling herself, and I didn't want to invest in a huge amount of product, and we weren't planning on being there for that long. So it just, it sort of was a good marriage of skills, I guess, and resources to start something.
Yeah. And so then after I sort of left and kind of continued doing my book and so on, then I remember distinctly you sharing on social media about you having had health problems because of one of the homes that you had been living in. So you were telling me a little bit earlier that it wasn't the home that's in the book. No. I'm relieved to hear that. But you had to, those owners had sold that place, and then you moved into a new place, and then you got sick. So can you just share a little bit about your experience with that? Because I just think that I haven't had this experience myself, but I'm hearing it more and more about people getting sick from their homes. And I think it's so important for us to be aware of the materials that are in a home, and even sometimes how they're built and those other elements. So it's, and it kind of affects people indiscriminately. It's just, yeah, like I said, I'm hearing it more and more. So can you share your story with that?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. Like, I'm sort of at that point now that experience has just changed how I look at buildings and design and things completely. We moved to a house which was, I think, a sort of 70s craftsman house, which had vaulted ceilings, wood paneling, and I was very attracted to the character of the home. Unfortunately, with that, they'd done a quick renovation on the kitchen. There was an integrated fridge, which we later found out was leaking into the subfloor, and they had put a sort of cheap vinyl flooring on, which had trapped the moisture, so you couldn't see the water damage. And we moved in, and it was quite soon after my health just sort of started deteriorating quite rapidly, and not really sure what was going on. And
so what were some of the symptoms that you got in the early stages?
Without sounding like a hypochondriac, I don't know why I still feel quite embarrassed about talking about it, because I think if someone had told me their experience before this, I don't know how sympathetic I would have been. I'd like to think I was, but it just seems so made up. It's not like someone with a broken arm or something where you can actually see it. There's such random symptoms, and it happens in such a funny way that the reaction you get from people when you tell them is quite varied.
Yeah.
Particularly even with doctors. And it was, yeah.
That's why we need to talk about it.
Yeah, we do need to talk about it, and I need to find a way to explain it properly. But for me, it started with headaches, vertigo, chronic fatigue. My energy levels rapidly just deteriorated to a point where I couldn't even walk to sort of the end of the block and drop my son at school without going and lying down for 3 hours afterwards. And at the time my daughter was sort of maybe a year and a half. So not an ideal time to not be able to take care of your young children. My son was also quite sick. We would sort of have episodes of like projectile vomiting, and like I would be sick to a point where I was just, throwing up and headaches, very dizzy. I started to slur my words, and
this is all very legitimate.
Yeah, but it just seemed
that you couldn't put your finger on what it was.
I kept saying to my husband, something's poisoning me, and I went down the path of EMFs, it's because I knew something was affecting me, and I thought, well, either, like, it sounds really dramatic, but either I'm a really big hypochondriac and I'm going crazy, or I'm dying, and it has to be one or the other, because nothing else makes sense. And I was seeing different doctors. I was getting these crazy sinus infections where I had staph pneumonia and strep pneumonia, staph infections in my sinuses, just continuously, and going to see ENTs and seeing neurologists who were saying my function wasn't there, but there was no physical, brain scans weren't showing anything, so they couldn't really explain it. They would just send me to the next specialist, which was quite frustrating, and I felt like no one believed me, and that was quite disheartening. Not my family or my friends, but in terms of the doctors that I was seeing, and they would just try and prescribe me with antibiotics for whatever that symptom was at the time, and they weren't putting two and two together and putting environmental factors together, and it kept getting worse, and I had to resign from my work, and I had to stop working because it was getting so bad.
And what kind of time frame is this happening over?
6 months.
Okay.
So it was 6 months from when we moved in to when we moved till we found the problem. And it wasn't until I started listening to podcasts and trying to educate myself, I guess, on things, because I wasn't getting the help that I needed. And I sort of discovered what integrated doctors do, and found an integrated doctor in LA, which was expensive, and nothing was covered under health insurance. And she started to put together a timeline of, when did you move into your house? What had happened in the last 6 months, and paint a picture and put all the symptoms together. And she just asked me, is there mold in your house? And I said, no, I don't think so. I said, our fridge is leaking, and I've asked our landlord to have a look at it, and nothing had been done. And I went home, and the floor had started to lift in front of the fridge, and I thought maybe this is, I need to push this a little bit further. And the next week they pulled the fridge out and opened the floor, and the whole thing was just up the drywall, under the floors, in the backs of our kitchen cabinets. So we'd actually been ingesting it in the fridge, and that's why our stomachs and everything was so upset, as well as, being on our plates and in our pots and pans and
How
things
did
like
you feel at that moment? Were you kind of either, like, I'd imagine just horrified, but also maybe relieved as well, because at least you know what it is?
Yeah, I think,
Did you cry? Like, I think I would have cried.
I can't remember.
Or were you angry? Like,
well, our landlords were so sweet and they were such lovely people, and it wasn't intentional that I couldn't ever be angry at them. And as soon as they found out, they tried to remedy it.
Yeah, I mean, not so much angry at them, but like...
I was more angry at the doc. Like, I was upset that I'd been made to feel so crazy.
Yeah.
Because I really started to question myself.
Yeah.
And it really affected my mood and my hormones, and it affected everything in my body to what I could eat. And it's been such a long process and an expensive process to get to where I am now, when I'm probably still in the 80% of feeling like my normal self. And it's been years. It's been 2.5 years. So
I guess as soon as you found that, did you move out of that house then?
We moved out, and they remediated the kitchen. They actually had to pull out the entire kitchen, the drywall, subflooring, everything. Was very expensive for them. And we agreed to move back in and try it. But we moved back in and I had reactions straight away.
Yeah.
It was because it would have been in the heating system, and with that, I was so sensitive at that point that it wasn't an option for me to go back.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, what I learned is that not everyone is affected by mold. My husband was completely fine. My daughter was fine, but my son and I had reactions, and I think it comes down to like a gene mutation.
Yeah.
Of whether you actually store the mold or you detox it.
Yeah.
And for me, I was storing it. So
right.
I've got such high levels of mytoxins in my system now that, you don't naturally get rid of it. You have to be helped to detox that from your system.
Yeah.
But it just shows that the health of your home is so important. The materials that we use, the things that we're choosing, not to take shortcuts in the way that we approach things, because the ramifications can be quite serious, and it isn't something that you can see it's something that's just sort of people starting to acknowledge how serious it is. But at the time, just no one sort of knew about it, and I felt very, kind of alone in my discovery and doing the research by myself.
Yeah. And I'm sure that this is probably something that's been affecting people for decades and if not hundreds of years, but they would probably just have been told that they were crazy. And I mean, it's good that now there is this greater awareness. I mean, I know certainly with my husband, he's definitely sensitive to mold. He can walk into a room and say, it's really moldy in here. There's something mold. And I'm really? Are you really? And it really affects him. And he used to get sinus infections a lot when he was working in air-conditioned offices, because I guess things are just recirculating, particularly within those kind of spaces. And since he's been working from home, he doesn't get sinus infections hardly ever. So we really are so affected by our environment in that way.
Yeah, I wanted to go and live in a tent in the desert. That's sort of the point that I got to. I just was, it was, I'd sort of lost my mind, I think, for a little while. But as soon as you out of that, and 2 weeks out of that environment, I would notice the difference and be like, oh, that's my normal self again. Wow, my brain is working again. And it's funny because I thought I was pregnant a lot of the time, because the symptoms, not being able to remember, feeling sick, headache, just all that. I kept at the beginning just doing pregnancy tests. I was like, I'm sure I must be pregnant. What else could it be?
Yeah.
But it was.
And so then when you moved into your next home, what did you look for? Because I'm sure you must have been a bit paranoid almost of like, I've got to make sure that wherever I live next is super healthy, like the checks that you can do, or did you?
We weren't so good with the next one because it was sort of temporary. It was just like a bit of a panic of we need to find somewhere to stay. And then we moved into a more permanent, and my husband just chosen, it was a new build, which for me, I just love old homes. But he just said to me, this is not what works for you and your health right now. Yes, it's romantic and it's, it's beautiful, but what we need is a new home that, is well built. It has a lot of airflow, a lot of natural light. And so we ended up moving into a new build, which was all those things. It had really big windows. It had really good air circulation, and things just got so much better for me quite quickly in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And so is that where you were living prior to coming
Yes.
back to Australia most recently?
Yes. And so, I felt very lucky to be in that house. I resisted it at the beginning because, as I said, I wasn't really my style, but it's more important to be healthy than it is to sort of have these sort of romantic notions. And I will get to a point where I can live in old homes again, I'm sure, but it's not, for me right now.
Yeah. And so, okay, so you said that you had to stop working when you got really sick. And so then at what point did you start returning to work? And was that then doing private interior design jobs?
Yes. Yeah, so I started going back, just working like consulting. I was working for my husband doing styling for his events. But it's sort of just been the last year or so that I've sort of gradually been increasing the work I do and the size of the projects. So last year was probably my first proper year back working again.
And what a year it was, though, because I know we were just talking about this prior to recording, but there was at least two big that I know of, interior design jobs that you were working on. One being with, we both know Jodie Fried from Armadillo & Co., who's an amazing person. I can't wait to get her on the podcast one day. I've known her for a very long time. We sort of kind of, our journeys sort of gone in parallel, and it's been so amazing to see what she's grown with her business. But you've been doing some work with her on her own home, is that right?
Yes, we've been working on that. That they built a really amazing home in Venice. I don't know when it was finished, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, and we've been sort of working on that, mainly sort of consulting with her and doing the furnishings. Obviously, she's got amazing talent and taste herself, so it's been sort of a collaboration of us working together on that for quite some time, and we've just finished that sort of a couple of months ago, the furnishing of that place. And then I had another big project sort of from July last year until November.
And that's the one that has just been published in Architectural Digest in the US. So can you share how you got that job and what was involved with it?
That came from a word of mouth, like a recommendation. But I had met my clients socially before that, and we had sort of connected over conversations about antiques and materials with patina and materials that had past lives, and we were sort of very much on the same path in terms of our value systems in terms of design. And they started to tell me about the house that they had recently just built, and they'd moved in with all their furniture from their previous home, and they were ready to start redecorating properly. And they asked me to come and have a look at it. They were actually leaving to go to London the next day to film, and I went over there the next morning, and it just worked, and I started quite soon after that.
So a lot of people who listen to this podcast, and I know that they're very much at the beginning of their journey, and to sort of land a client that's got presumably a decent kind of budget, it's like the ideal. Were you given carte blanche, and what was the actual process? Like, did you have to submit mood boards? Can you just break it down a little bit? What was the actual process with that job?
Yeah, so the job grew as my experience with every other project. You start and the scope of work changes. And so we were just going to do the living room upstairs, and it ended up being the majority of the house. I presented mood boards at the beginning. I did a lot of digital mock-ups. They were overseas the entire time, so everything that I had to work to was all digital presentations. We they were sort of across all the major purchases, but a lot of it they gave me the freedom to do myself, which was really nice.
Were they very specific about what they wanted, or did you have carte blanche to do whatever, well, not whatever you want, but like sometimes it's finding that right balance between what they want and giving you the freedom to kind of go and source what you think's right?
I would say a bit of both. They're definitely very, they were quite particular about the mood and the feel that they wanted and the types of things they wanted in there, but they didn't want to achieve a certain look or aesthetic, which most of the other clients that I've worked with sort of want to go to an aesthetic rather than a feeling. And they were more motivated by a feeling rather than, I guess, achieving a certain look that fitted a certain category. The process was quite intuitive. I sort of made choices that reflected their individuality, their values, and at times even their sense of humor. One of them has a very sort of deep-seated passion for antiques and collectibles, and so we sort of built on that premise. They have a beautiful furniture collection already, so I just sort of drew inspiration from that and kept the process evolving from there. And they have a beautiful art collection, so the colors and the mood boards I created were sort of taken from things that they already owned. When we sort of walked around the house, I asked them to point out things that they loved and they treasured, and I asked them why, and that sort of built my value system from there as to what their motivations were and what they expected and what they would connect to.
Yeah. And so if you don't mind kind of getting a little bit practical with it, like, because I think many people who listen, they don't know how to go about billing hours, like working. Did you like log your hours, or was it a set fee? And how do you work? Like, do you use InDesign, or what do you use, like the technical, practical components of actually designing and charging for your services? How do you work that out, and how do you do that?
So I usually charge a consult fee to begin with for my time to come out to do an initial mood board and set the tone, and then that is obviously credited if we move forward. And then I usually work to an hourly basis. If the scope of work is quite easy to define, I will give a project price to a limit, and then with a certain amount of changes that they can make, because sometimes you nail things in one or two goes, and sometimes it can be quite a lengthy process. So there has to be reasonable expectations and I just set that out as a statement of works. How many changes that involves, what the hours that looks like for me, if that's a project price. If not, if it's more just an hourly price, I just charge hourly, and sometimes we just cap it.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the things about interior design is it can be like, how long is a piece of string sometimes, and it can be very hard to kind of foresee with some things how long it can take to find the right piece. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to feel guilty about charging if it's taking you longer than what you might anticipate, but at the same time, you've got to charge for your time. Like,
yeah. And I think, from my experience, sourcing antiques takes a lot longer than sourcing new product, because it is like it can take a lot of time to find the right piece, and for that I give sort of a set hours, and if it does go over that, then you can continue to charge. Or another way to do it is obviously to do a markup on product, so you obviously get a designer discount and you absorb that, so that also helps cover part of the design cost.
Yep.
So, I mean, for me, I prefer to focus more on the hours spent, because it's just what sort of worked for me. But sometimes it's a combination of a markup on product plus my time. But I have learned setting sort of set prices for project. I have been burnt in my early days where things took me a lot longer than what I expected. And then your hourly rate really, when you start looking at it, diminishes quite quickly. So that's sort of what I've learned to put in my statement of works, is the sort of expectation in time And then once that goes over, or if the scope of work changes, then that is obviously revised in the way that we charge.
Yeah. And so in amongst all of this,
Yes.
I know again, like sort of seeing from Instagram that you kind of come backwards and forwards a couple of times to Australia to work on a couple of projects here, including the one that we're at the moment, which is the beach ranch in Angourie. So, which I'm always amazed at, that you come and you're doing a little trip to Australia and I'm renovating an outdoor area or a kitchen or whatever it is. And obviously that's working on a very different budget, I would imagine, and sort of using sort of like local trades, it's a smaller community, so you've got smaller resources to pull on. So what are some of the big things that you've learned from doing these kind of projects in Australia? And I guess they're predominantly for Airbnb, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So as you say, like I've had to sort of do bite-sized projects while I am in the country, and actually some projects I've done completely remotely. I feel like the last couple of years of the projects I've been working on, a lot of it has been remote working. My clients have been overseas, or I've been overseas from the project, and I've just learned to be very good at mocking things up digitally and being very, very specific and granular with what I want.
So okay, just to stop you there. So what are you mocking it up on?
I actually use Keynote. For a lot of things.
You have to give me a crash course tutorial afterwards.
It doesn't seem that sophisticated, but for me, it works for my purposes. I mean, I use SketchUp for floor plans and things like that. But if I'm just trying to give the electrician, say, a position for an outlet or something like that, I find it really easy to drop things in and give measurements and just sort of cut and paste things in a Keynote platform and just send them a visual of what I'm talking about. And I will sort of like drop in a photo of the room and actually mock it up on the room so that they can see it. And it just has helped me so much.
I'm going to ask you, did you use Keynote when you were working for the Iconic, or is that where you learned it? No.
I don't know. I don't remember when I started using it, and I've never met anyone else that uses it in the way that I do, but people always ask me when they see the work that I do. I mean, I guess I use it for decks, like when I create mood boards and I do presentations to begin with. And then I just sort of kept playing with it and realizing that it just visually represents what I want to achieve so quickly that it just sort of serves my purposes really well, really efficiently.
I love that, because I think people get so hung up sometimes on that you have to use this program or you have to use that program. And it really does come down to what's easiest for you and what gets the results that you want. So it really doesn't have to be about doing what everyone else is doing. It's just, what works for you. I mean, I use InDesign because that's my background in magazine publishing, that's what we would use. And I use InDesign for everything because I'm just so familiar with the program.
And I think the more you use something, the more efficient you become at it, and it just becomes your sort of go-to. And for me, as I said, I use SketchUp a lot, but I have used InDesign in the past. But for me, the way my brain works, it's just a very quick, easy way to sort of get an idea across when I can't be there to show someone in person.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So we've spoken about a healthy home, but I know that sustainability, is that rain? Gosh, it's really starting to pour down. It's been such a funny day of like, sometimes the sun's coming out and then it's pouring with rain, but that's okay. Now, I know that having a healthy home is, well, can we just touch on, because we didn't really, like, what are some of the key components that you look for in terms of making a home healthy with materials? What are some of the things that you learned, a couple of the big takeaways?
I think obviously airflow, like ventilation is a huge component. Natural materials that do breathe, and actually like if there is water damage, you'll see it because it's not plastic, it's not hiding anything. So I think that's really important, that if something's going to get damaged, you're gonna know about it pretty quickly. I think obviously you can't see walking in what kind of paint people have used or anything like that, but when you go to do it, obviously choosing paints, finishes and things like that have low VOCs is super important. The way things are glued together, and whether you're looking at a kitchen or something else, looking at the materials and sort of looking at their like material safety data sheets and actually seeing what is in this and what is it rated, and doing a bit of research. But in terms of just walking into a house, I guess natural light, the flooring, the ventilation, those types of things sort of make it a little bit healthier.
Yeah. And so what I was going to say is that you're also quite passionate about sustainable design, aren't you? Like that's one of the things that you're quite passionate about, which I do feel that they go often quite hand in hand. A healthy home is often quite a sustainable home. What are some of the things that you've done or materials that you like to try and use in spaces that are very sustainable? Or what are some of the big lessons that you've learned about sustainable design?
I guess for me, sustainable design, like everyone has a different approach to it. For me, it's about legacy and circular economy. And growing up in an antique store, I sort of had this appreciation that if something's well built and well made, it will outlive you in a positive way. So I'm looking at furniture that may have been sold 3, 5, maybe 20 times and had different chapters and different owners, because it is well built and well made, and it can be refinished, it can be fixed if it gets damaged, whereas you sort of buy something that is cheap and made out of MDF. Once you damage it, it's done, it goes into landfill, and it still outlives you, but it outlives you in landfill, giving off harmful gases. So for me, when I look at something that I choose, I sort of think, okay, well, beyond this use, where is it going to end up? Is it going to be able to be refinished or repurposed or sold on to somebody else? It's going to give it another life. And can it be recycled? Can it biodegrade? These are the things that I'm looking at. I sort of tend to look at the end of life, and not just the single purpose of whether it's a light or a piece of furniture or the material made to use a kitchen, for example. Okay, beyond this use in 10 years time and 15 years time, what can people do with it?
Yeah. And I guess just circling back to one of the other things that we were talking about is you had started your business Palm Beach Black. So are you still doing anything with that, or where are you at with that? And what's your focus now at the moment? Is it mainly interior design?
Yeah, so I haven't run the store for some time because it was just quite hard for me to be traveling back and forth and being my customer base in Australia and being based in America. It seemed counterproductive to start shipping things all over the world. Wasn't really where I wanted the business to go, and working for clients and being more service-based was sort of hitting more of my targets of what I wanted to do and the imprint that I wanted to leave. I still would like to make products eventually, but at the moment it didn't serve me, and it didn't sort of serve its purpose. I also found I've lost the name. I've rebranded as my own name because it is more of a service that I'm offering, but also I found it hard to have a tone, and it didn't mean anything to me anymore. It was, I sort of outgrew it, I guess. And hopefully, the brand can evolve, and I'm not really sure where I want to go with it, but it will probably, if I do make products, it will be with a focus on materials that are found and reused rather than sort of creating new.
Yeah. And so what are you working on, any other interior design projects at the moment other than these two here?
I have one here in Australia that I'm doing from distance, but my main focus at the moment is I've got a 2-bedroom unit that I'm renovating adjacent to this one, which has been, it's sort of grown. It was going to be sort of a smaller smaller project when we were thinking we would go back to LA, but since we're going to be sort of here for some time now, it's sort of grown. The project has grown, and we've done a full renovation.
Yeah. And do you think, are you in your happy place in terms of the type of work that you're doing at the moment?
I am. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I think I've found a way to explain to trades that what's important to me when I am making changes, and that has really helped the process. I've obviously become more confident in my choices, and also to the way that I communicate it, instead of feeling like I'm being painful in terms of my decisions, which is something that I've come across a lot in the past. Is sort of doing it the way that I want to do it is not necessarily the most efficient or the most economical, but I'm sort of thinking long term and not just short term. And that is something that I've had to find a way to explain to, whether it was the people that were making my cushions years ago that kept asking me to buy material off the roll, or if it's a tradesman sort of trying to do something, quite quickly, and I'm diddly-daddling trying to find, a vintage door to use instead of, a new one or something like that. It's just sort of, being able to communicate has been a big learning for me.
Yeah. And I do think it's one of the harder things about sort of trying to build more sustainably and in a more healthy way, being really conscious of the materials that are used, because so many trades do things because that's the way it's always been done. And then if you're suddenly questioning what material, which grout are you using, and what's the kind of the toxicity of that, and you're trying to research, or until you kind of get to that sort of learning threshold of instantly what is the one that you want. That's certainly my experience at the moment. It's I'm kind of on a bit of a sharp learning curve, and just not sort of saying, oh, well, that's just, you go with what's always been done, like to actually question every material that is used, and then people start to
and to not annoy people when you do it. And I think you're absolutely right. And for me, just sort of bring it back, the main thing I've learned is to question, but then to avoid not annoying, but like how do I put this?
They want to get the job done, don't they?
Yeah, they want to get the job done and not offending someone, because they obviously have expertise in that area, and they are doing it the most efficient and probably trying to save you money. And they have all the best intentions in the world, and then you start questioning them, you don't want to offend that person. And I remember listening to a podcast about going low waste, and her name evades me now, but the French lady that started the whole low waste movement, I remember listening to her when she started, and her experience of going into a cheese shop, or I can't remember the example, and asking them if she could use her own containers because she didn't want to use their plastic ones. And of course, the man in the cheese shop got offended because she was putting the onus on him to provide the low waste solution. And she found the response to be quite defensive. And then she realized that she had to explain her values and put it back on herself and go in and say, hey, I'm really trying, I've challenged myself to do this. I would really appreciate if you could help me do it. I'd really, value your input. And then the reaction to that being completely like, oh, of course we can do that, and just a different sort of reaction. And I find the same way when I go and talk to trades or something, is to explain to them the values and why I want to do it. And once they know, they're so happy to help and so happy to learn. And that's what I found with installing the ply kitchen in the project I'm doing at the moment. The quickest, most efficient way is to do an MDF kitchen. But when I started explaining the reason I wanted to do ply was because I had to look at maybe in 10 years' time, I might want to sand it back and refinish it or add handles. And it gives me the option to be able to make those changes later on. They went, oh, of course. I don't know why we haven't sort of thought of that before. And then super helpful in trying to source that material for me.
Yeah. No, that's a really, really good piece of advice. Okay, I've got a few other questions that I wanted to ask you. Before I do, though, I will quickly ask you this. I know I feel like we could talk and talk and talk, but I did want to just ask you about Instagram, because I do think that this is such an important tool for anyone really who's got a creative, any kind of product or service, but certainly within the creative fields, Instagram feels best suited to sharing your work, sharing your journey, all of that kind of thing. But obviously we don't always share every part of the journey. How do you choose to show up on Instagram? How do you see that tool, and what do you share, and why do you share it? And can you just give a little bit of an insight into that?
Well, I don't think I use Instagram very well. And I listened to your podcast a couple of episodes ago and I just listened to it going, I don't do that. I tend to get so caught up in whatever I'm working on at the time that I might take photos, but I absolutely forget to post them and share as I'm working on things. And that's something that I'm trying to do more now, is to involve people in the process as it happens, because the last couple of years I've just been taking photos and then thinking, oh, I should share that now. And it's already sort of come and happened, and I haven't been able to give it a sort of genuine explanation of what I'm doing at the time. So I'm definitely trying to do things a little bit more timely at the moment. I did have my handle as Palm Beach Black for a long time, which I found quite restrictive in that, particularly more because I was going more into service rather than selling product. I couldn't find my tone, I couldn't find my voice, and it was quite hard for me. But I sort of started with that name because I wanted to hide behind it, and I didn't want to have my face out there on a public profile. I'm a very private person. My husband's even more private, and it's taken a lot of confidence for me to share. And I don't share a lot of personal stuff on there, but it has helped me sort of change to my name because I can explain my reasoning for things and my values a little bit better using my own voice.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Well, even if you don't tick off the things that I've mentioned, I certainly think you have a very beautiful feed, and it's very authentic. And I think that your passion for sustainable design and for a healthy home really comes through. And I do think it's interesting that it's such a personal decision about whether you do share more of your private life or not. And there's no right or wrong answer. It really does just come down to what feels right for you. And I know personally, I've kind of gone more one way and then I've gone more the other. And I think that, and I think it changes in your life as well at different seasons, and maybe when kids are younger, you can feel a different way. But there isn't a right or wrong, but just what feels right for you. And I think with deep within whether that's what you want to do or you don't want to do. You just got to listen to that kind of internal gut instinct.
Yeah.
All right, I've got some questions here, and these I'd love hearing people's answers because they're always quite different, and it gives a little bit of an insight into you and your journey and your process. So the first question, as I always say, is the hardest one. I might have to revisit these questions because everyone struggles with the first one, but it's really what comes to top of mind. What 5 words would best describe you?
Resourceful. I'm a dork. I'm hardworking. That's definitely intuitive. Optimistic, maybe. Yeah, is that 5?
Around that. We don't have to be pedantic about it. What's the best life or career lesson you've learned?
Just to trust in the process, I think. I think just to, not get too caught up in an outcome, and just to sort of to just trust that my decision making is going to work out. I think that's probably my biggest sort of career learning, is to trust in my own creative process, and that I don't need to be able to see the complete end result, but I will get there through problem solving, and that would probably be it.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's a hard one to answer.
Yeah, sorry. I torture people with these questions, but it's so interesting. What's your proudest career achievements?
Definitely the project we just talked about, being featured in Architectural Digest. I mean, I think obviously I was floating on some pretty big coattails of a very famous architect and some high-profile clients, but I believe that my work was the best reflection of who I am as a designer, and it just sort of ticked a lot of boxes in terms of being able to be completely free to not only aesthetically achieve the look and feel that I wanted, but to have the freedom and the trust to also make the right sustainable decisions. I think I was very particular about recording all my purchases on that, and I went back and did a report on that for my client, and over 80% of my budget was actually spent on antiques or vintage materials. And that was something I was really, really proud of, because that's where I want to go. And I think it is hard to explain that to people, and people do want a little bit of it, but to have someone that just went, yeah, absolutely lean into it and just completely be so aligned with my value system was just so liberating. And I came away from that just thinking, I've done this huge home and I can tell you exactly the amount of waste that I created. And I know that all those pieces that are going into there are going to either be handed on to their kids or taken to their next home. And it just felt really, really good. And I think that was the pinnacle of, okay, this is where my career is going, and this is what I want people to recognize in my work and ask me for. And sort of now knowing that if it doesn't sort of fit that mold, that I can walk away from work now.
Yeah. I think that is such a big part of the kind of creative journey, and particularly when you sort of get a little bit further along it and you get to that point where you really can, in some circumstances, choose what you say no to. You're not just working for the sake of working, but you're working on the types of projects that you really want to. And that when you put that work out there, and this is something I say a lot to people who do my styling course, is that you don't have to share all of your work. Share the type of work that you want to do more of.
Yes.
And I think that when you kind of talk about that and you highlight that, then that's what you attract as well. And if that's the type of work you want to go forward, then it's really important.
And I think I've sort of struggled to find the tone in which to talk about it, where it's not lecturous or it's not sort of grandstanding, greenwashing or anything like that. This is just genuinely my process, and finding sort of the right tone of talking about that. And I think I've sort of got to that point where I can now, and I think people, can appreciate that process. So I think that, my last sort of year or two of work has really sort of been that sort of pinnacle of finding that balance. And then this sort of project was sort of, or it all sort of was a big, I guess, crescendo of all those sort of things working together. So that's why I'm most proud of that work.
Yeah. And I think that also draws on sort of when you say that on Instagram, if you use that as a way to share your journey about the materials you choose and why, it then isn't a kind of grandstanding. And I completely get what you say, that sometimes it can feel hard, well, certainly does for me, to sort of have that fine line between when you feel very passionate about it and you want everyone to kind of convert to your way of thinking, to sort of say, this is what you should do, but when you just show that this is what I'm doing and this is why I'm doing it, and you show the journey of that, I think that that's often more captivating for people than sort of being told, this is, what you should do, or this is my philosophy, but you're not necessarily taking people on that journey with you. So anyway, a bit of a side note, but what's been your best decision?
I think stopping working for other people. I mean, we obviously, circling back, that was where I didn't want to go for so long, and I did avoid working for myself, watching my parents run their own business. But I think that has been the moment of really defining who I am, what I stand for, and then getting the work that I want. Because working for other people, I was always, it was getting washed away. Like everything was getting kind of watered down in terms of the choices that I made, because they weren't all my choices to make. And so I think being able to work for myself, I can be completely who I am and everything that I stand for in my work. And I think that's been really liberating for me.
Okay, I'm going to ask you another question about that. Sorry.
That's all right.
Because I'm just curious that you say, because that was one of your big concerns, was that you saw your parents working so hard, working weekends. Is that what you're doing now? And if so, do you sort of see it, well, actually, maybe it wasn't so bad what they were doing because they were doing what they loved? Or do you feel like you've created different types of boundaries so that you don't, maybe it's because it's more project-based rather than all the time? Like, how have you managed to not relive that? Or are you, and you actually think it's fine?
I mean, I think not being tied down to a physical location like a retail store has obviously helped a lot. Doing project-based stuff, I can fit it in with our schedule. And I mean, not now, but we obviously were traveling a lot more back and forth, and my husband travels for work. So I was able to sort of work projects in around what we were doing for the year rather than being tied down to a physical location of running a store. So I think that was a main thing. And I think now that I look back at it, I'm so glad that I got to be part of what my parents did. I mean, they worked so hard, and they just had this blend of, personal life. It was social for them. There were so many different layers to it that now I appreciate looking back at it. The parties that they had, the clients that became friends, all that came from it. And now my kids, they come with me when we're working on things, and they see how hard I work. And I think it's only adding value. I don't think, I think it's a good balance now. There's obviously times where I feel like it's a little bit too much, and you feel guilty, but for the most part, it works for us.
Yeah. Okay, back to the question.
That's all right.
Who inspires you?
I'm going to go back to my parents again with this one. That's obviously an answer, but I think the fact that they have always stayed true to their ideals and their identity, sort of never been fazed by fads or fashions or friends or anything. They've just always been who they are. And I think that has been, even when it's been uncomfortable, I think they've just really stuck to their value system. And I think that that's something that I've taken away from them. I think, as cheesy as it sounds, my husband, he's inspired me to be very fair in terms of work and always treat people really well in terms of business and be very fair, and also to take stock of where I'm at the moment. Like, he's very good at living in the moment, whereas I can be a little bit sort of in the future with everything. And so he sort of is very good at sort of bringing me back to where we're at right now. In terms of career, I'd say who inspires me at the moment is someone I discovered recently with Athena Calderon, who's a New York-based designer. And I think a big aha moment for me is when she has a podcast called More Than One Thing, and she talks about people that are sort of multi-hyphenates, and something that I'd always been a little, not ashamed, but it was hard to explain what I did to people. There was no 30-second elevator pitch that I could give people about my work. And for me, it didn't fit neatly in a box, and I found that hard. But she sort of, the way she talks about it has made me embrace what I do and be proud of it. And I think that has inspired me a lot to sort of, really step into that part of my personality.
I was actually listening to a couple of her podcasts on the drive down, so there you go.
They're good, aren't they?
Yeah, no, I love it. She's amazing in what she's created and her interiors, but yeah, just how she sort of shows up again on social media. She seems very true to herself, and no, it's really great. What are you passionate about?
I think in terms of my career, like environmental stewardship would be the main thing. Just being very aware that we're only like a blot on this earth and this timeline, and that making the most of my time here and just making it count. I think that's sort of my passion at the moment, is just to work out what do I want to leave behind, and environmentally what kind of impact do I want to leave. And that's what I'm sort of passionate about learning. I don't know everything, and I'm quite, compared to other people, I don't really know that much, but I'm very passionate about learning more, and sort of teaching my kids about being good stewards and looking after the country and the earth that we live on.
Yep. What dream do you still want to fulfill?
Just career-wise or personal, or
either or?
I mean, a personal one, it would be, I've always wanted to do a 7-day horse ride through Montana. That was something I wanted to do. That's very random, but like something that I wanted to do while we were in America. I mean, I think it's something that I've always wanted to do since I was a small child watching The Horse Whisperer, but clearly my ideas of cattle ranches have changed somewhat as an adult. So maybe I don't want to do that anymore. But I think to go out and do a few more sort of, when I don't have young kids, few more sort of personal challenges like that, like physical and just sort of getting back to nature, which I think it's hard to do when you're a mother of young kids, to sort of take that time for yourself. But I think, as I get older, that will be sort of something that there's a few sort of dreams of sort of personal challenges that I would like to do that aren't options for me right now. But that's good because I can look forward to them.
Yeah, that's cool. What are you reading? Are you reading anything at the moment? Any books or I don't think people read magazines anymore, but
I've got 2 books on the go at the moment. One's called White Girl. I can't remember who wrote that. And then another one by Meg Mason called Sorrow and Bliss, which I've just started, but I don't seem to get through many pages without being interrupted. So I'm a slow reader.
Yep. What about, you mentioned that you've sort of listened to quite a few podcasts. What are some of your favorite podcasts that you like to listen to? And I would love to get afterwards, maybe you can share the one that the low waste one that you mentioned earlier on. We can put that in the show notes.
I can't remember which one that was, but I listened to something called the Zero Waste Countdown, which has always sort of been helpful in terms of like moving into more of a low waste lifestyle. I haven't listened to that for a little while, but I have a lot in the past. Obviously in print. I just started listening to one called, I think it's called Always Was, Always Will Be, which is sort of more Indigenous stories and focus, like more of that sort of focus. So broadening what I'm listening to at the moment.
And lastly, what piece of advice would you give to your younger self?
I think that probably comes back to that sort of lesson I learned, is just to trust the process. And I think learning that sometimes seeds need time after they've been planted to grow into something. Like, I think when you start your career, you think, I want to do this and I want to do this, I want to do that, but not everything can happen at the very beginning, and they may be sort of things that will happen within your career, but you don't have to have them all at the one time in order to be successful or to feel successful. And I think just to acknowledge where you want to go with it, but then also just to trust the process of actually getting there in a genuine, authentic way rather than forcing it.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast. I'm glad that we finally made it happen. And I've loved hearing a little bit more about your design process and your journey, and I hope that your story about the health issues that you had really is kind of eye-opening for people in the best kind of way. And I hope that we can kind of continue to have these conversations. And I look forward to seeing more of your journey on Instagram as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. All right, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this interview and learning more about Arabella's creative journey. Before you go, if you haven't done so already, I'd really appreciate if you could take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It really does help get the word out there to other people who might find it helpful. You'll find show notes for this episode at nataliewalton.com/podcast/29, because this is episode number 29. Thank you to Jaeger Media for producing this podcast and the people of the Bundjalung Nation where it was recorded. I look forward to connecting again soon. I'm Natalie Walton, and you've been listening to Imprint.